Beyond Reason Radio.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 1,190 points, or 4.4% today. The Dow had its worst day since February 2018, while the NASDAQ and S&P 500 posted its biggest one-day loss since August 2011. It was also the Dow's biggest one-day point decline in history. This is Beyond Reason Radio. I'm your host, Michael Yaffee, the voice of reason in a world that is beyond reason, the antidote to the Bernie Sanders socialism virus. Yes, the antidote or the vaccine, whatever you want to call it, to the Bernie Sanders socialism virus. We have to get into this. I haven't done a show since the Democrat debate in South Carolina.
Oh.
So I know people want a voice of reason on that. They want my analysis on that. We'll get into that and more throughout the hour, because we're on until 8 p.m. here on News Radio WFLA Orlando. But I know a lot of people listen to the podcast. If you can't catch the whole show, or you can never catch the show live, make sure to download the podcast. You can get it on your iHeartRadio app or anywhere podcasts are available, and subscribe to it. If you actually subscribe to it, you'll see when it's updated. You'll see when I post a new one. By the way, we're on Facebook Live as well. You can like the Beyond Reason Radio Facebook page, or just send me a personal friend request on Facebook if you want. But we're on Facebook Live as well. And once again, producing Mr. Tom Benson is here. Tom Benson, I don't know if you've looked at your 401k or anything, if you have a 401k, but
that was spent a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, good then, because it would be gone anyway, apparently, after the coronavirus.
I just want to know why I don't get a Facebook camera over here. I mean, even if I wave, it doesn't do any good.
Well, you see budget cuts.
Oh, all right.
Actually, apparently the station is working on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which I don't know if I'm happy about, because, it would be for the morning show too, and I'm in the control room in the morning. I don't know if I want to be on camera at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, does anyone really want to see me 5 o'clock?
If they do that, they'll have to get a makeup department.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we'll see when that happens. So, coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
Are you scared, Tom Benson?
No, I am not.
So, we're going to get into a lot of the political aspects of coronavirus on the show tonight, because it seems like most of this is just political. That we're just politicizing this whole thing before it's even really happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've also heard the term lately that this is Trump's Katrina.
How could it be Trump's Katrina? It hasn't happened yet. Nothing's happened here yet. I mean, jeez.
But you know it's going to, because he's not doing the right thing.
What? Okay, so here's what I generally think about it. There's a split among a lot of people on what exactly is going on here. And there's actually a split among conservatives, I've noticed, on what's going on in here. For instance, you have Tucker, who I think said on Fox, and Glenn Beck, who is on this station. Mm-hmm. They've been sounding the alarm, saying this could be really bad. But then you have Rush, who basically said the opposite, that, you don't want to catch it. It's a concern, but it seems like this is really being hyped for political reasons to hurt Trump.
Sounds like you better get a station memo out to all these guys.
To fall in line?
Toe the line.
Yeah, they all need to agree.
Same talking points.
I mean, people think that conservatives just get like Trump talking points and they all agree. This is proof that they don't. But I think it's really proof that we just don't know. I know that's hard for people to say in our arrogant social media, everyone has an opinion 2020 world. But maybe the wise thing to say right now would be, we don't exactly know what's going to happen yet. We don't know. Now, I am a little concerned because the stock market is plunging. It's gone down like 10% in the last week. It's pretty crazy to watch. So obviously there's something to be concerned about because the people in the business community are seeing things that are causing them to sell off stocks and everything else. The good news about that, people are saying it's going to tank the economy, yada, yada, yada. If not much ends up happening in the long run with coronavirus, the stock market will go up almost as quickly as it went down. It'll pretty much gain back everything it lost because most of this fall right now is based on speculation on what's going to happen. Not necessarily what has happened yet, but what's going to happen. So if not much happens, it'll go back up. Now, economically, that might be the biggest concern because China's been on lockdown, and that affects business here in the rest of the world. It just does. We have a global economy. But the more and more I hear about coronavirus, the more I realize that we just don't know. We just don't know. This reminds me of something from history, something I actually kind of talked about on the last show.
FDR is coming our way.
No, a little bit after FDR.
All right.
So in the last show, I talked about Sputnik and how the Democrats used Sputnik, the Russians launching the satellite, to basically fearmonger and to make Eisenhower look bad that the Russians were ahead of us and they're going to use this to drop nukes on us in the near future, and the Eisenhower administration doesn't care and blah, blah, blah. The reason why I'm bringing this up, I'm reading a really good book right now by Douglas Brinkley. It's called Moonshot, The Space Race and John F. Kennedy. Excellent book. I just want to recommend it. But it also talks about how John F. Kennedy, when he was senator and also running for president, he would make these speeches about the missile gap, the Soviet-U.S. missile gap. The United States is so far behind the Soviets with ICBMs, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. There is a missile gap. This is worrisome. We can't allow this to happen. And he would do speeches on this, and he basically ran for president partly on that. It was all a lie. There was no missile gap. The fact is, Kennedy didn't know. A lot of people didn't know because Soviet Union was hard to get intelligence out of the Soviet Union at the time. Under Khrushchev, it just was. But in fact, the Eisenhower administration had some intelligence because they were using the latest technology in the U-2 spy plane, something that the Soviets didn't have the technology to create. So we had these U-2 spy planes. We're flying them over the Soviet Union, and we basically have all this intelligence that the Soviet Union is a lot far behind than we thought. We had, before Kennedy became in office, we had satellites monitoring the Soviet Union. We had defense systems. We were actually ahead of the Soviet Union in a lot of things. But Kennedy would use this and say, "Oh, there's a missile gap. Everyone be afraid and vote for me," of course. Now, I appreciate what Kennedy did on wanting us to go to the moon, but my point is he got all the intelligence while he was running for president and after he was running for president saying, you realize the missile gap is not true. The CIA basically gave him all this intelligence that you've been wrong on this for a long time. We actually, here you go. There's no missile gap. The Soviet Union is not way far ahead of us on all this stuff. And he still went out there and basically fearmongered on most of it. I'm just pointing out that this stuff happens. And I get the feeling that that's what's happening now to a certain extent. That there's a lot of fear-mongering because we just don't know. Nothing has happened yet. So why don't we get to some of the sound cuts here? We have the Democrats blasting Trump on this, which I don't understand. I don't think have we had one death in the U.S. from coronavirus? No, we haven't had a single one. We've had minimal cases here. When you look at the evidence, it seems like, okay, maybe Trump's doing okay. China did terrible, obviously. Iran is doing awful. But, I mean, it's hard to blame Trump, but they still are. Here's Tom Steyer, who's running for president. He was on some liberal radio show or something today, and he's blasting Trump over coronavirus. Here it is.
He's absolutely incompetent. He absolutely stripped the Center for Disease Control of its money and of its capability. He's months late on this, Dean. This is a huge deal. And he's turning it over to Mike Pence?
Yep.
I can't be more scared. Look, he is incompetent. This is a much bigger deal than I think people in the United States understand in terms of how many people are going to be infected and how much economic impact it's going to have. Trump is incompetent.
3 times that phrase came up in 31 seconds.
I'm always a little skeptical when politicians have to beg you to believe that something's a big deal. Because it might not be because right now it's not as big of a deal to people. Mm-hmm. So the politicians have to go out there and try to convince you that it's like Michael Moore saying to people, this is like the French resistance, and that's why you have to vote for Bernie Sanders. He was basically begging you to believe that because in our daily lives, we don't believe that. So, and Steyer mentioned Mike Pence there, and I'm going to get into some of the Pence stuff a little bit later because once you actually look into what that's all about, I don't know if the Democrats have much of a leg to stand on that. But you also have Nancy Pelosi here, also basically blasting Trump over something that hasn't happened yet. Here she is.
What he's doing is late, too late, anemic. Hopefully we can make up for the loss of time. But it'll have to have the professionals in place, the resources that are adequate, and not be using scare tactics about people coming back to our country.
So there you go. What he's doing is too late. How is it too late? It hasn't happened yet. Nothing's I mean, it's happening in other parts of the world, but it seems like we're doing it as best as we can, and that's the problem here. There's only so much that can be done. Now, Trump, of course, he held a news conference last night briefing the nation on this, although the local news, the local news, not the local news, the world news, the network news broadcasts at 6:30. Mm-hmm. The broadcast. They didn't cover it. They said it was going to happen, but they didn't actually cover the press conference. Isn't that amazing? Uh-huh. He did it at like 6:30, probably so they would cover it, and they didn't do it. I'm like, I thought this is a big deal, but they didn't do it. But he last night held a news conference, and he fought back against Nancy Pelosi's comments and everything. Here's what he said.
I think Speaker Pelosi's incompetent. She lost the Congress once. I think she's going to lose it again. And I think she's not thinking about the country. And instead of making a statement like that, where I've been beating her routinely at everything, instead of making a statement like that, she should be saying we have to work together because we have a big problem potentially, and maybe it's going to be a very little problem. I hope that it's going to be a very little problem. But we have to work together. Instead, she wants to do that same thing with crying Chuck Schumer.
It's hard to argue with what Trump said there.
Yep.
Because that's all I've heard in the past few days is how the Democrats are screaming that Trump is incompetent and is not handling this right. And I'm thinking, it's just started. Why don't you stop that for a minute and actually just focus on the fact of trying to get something done? This is what I hate. I hate this stuff so much. I hate a lot of this politicking over stuff like this because it's like, even in my family situations or in relationships, I'm not one to really argue very much, getting into shouting matches very much because it doesn't solve anything. You know, I'm the kind of person that immediately wants to solve the problem. So if there's a problem in a relationship or something, I don't want to just yell about it. My brain just kind of works where I want to solve it. Okay, yelling about it's not going to do anything right now. Why don't we actually work to solve the problem? And I don't see any real effort here to actually solve the problem from what the Democrats are doing. So we're going to continue on. I have much more to say about coronavirus. We also have to get into the Democratic debate that happened earlier this week that was also Beyond Reason. This is Beyond Reason Radio. I'm your host, Michael Yaffee. We'll be right back.
If you miss any of the show, you can download the Beyond Reason podcast on iTunes. The voice of reason in a world that is beyond reason is back now.
So there's actually some breaking news right now. President Donald Trump is reportedly considering invoking special powers through a law that would allow the United States to rapidly and aggressively beef up its domestic manufacturing capabilities to combat the coronavirus.
Well,
the Defense Production Act, which was passed by Congress in 1950 at the outset of the Korean War, would mark an escalation of the administration's response to the outbreak. The virus first surfaced in China and has spread to other countries, including the U.S. That's what Reuters is reporting. The laws grant the president the power to expand industrial production of key materials or products for national security and other reasons.
Wall Street will like that.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I didn't think about that. The report noted that White House officials and Department of Homeland Security were considering using the law to rapidly produce protective gear in preparation of a possible outbreak in the U.S. It says, let's say Company A makes a multitude of respiratory masks, but they spend 80% of their assembly lines on masks that painters wear and only 20% on the time they need for this. We will have the ability to tell corporations, no, you change your production line, so it's now 80% of the other thing and 20% of that. That's according to a White House official. Now, I'm guessing this is just kind of a trial balloon. It might not be something that we need yet, but...
in other words, run it up the flagpole and let's see who salutes.
Yeah, but I mean, it's one of those things that I'm sure he'll be blasted for this too. You know, it's never going to be good enough.
You know what I say. Trump can say the sky is blue and he'd get pushback on that.
Yeah, exactly right. Welcome back to Beyond Reason Radio. We're talking about the coronavirus because it seems to be getting all the attention. And my basic point on this, thinking a lot about this today, is just there's so much speculation out there in the stock market. There's so much speculation out there in even conservative media, but in media in general, on both sides, newspapers. And all I can gather is we just don't know. You know, Socrates said the beginning of wisdom, you know, he said basically the beginning of wisdom is admitting you know nothing. Maybe we just need to wait for some more information because there's still a lot we don't know about this virus and what would happen. Mostly because it came out of China and China didn't give us all the information, still not giving us all the information. And we don't, know what's going on. Now, the latest criticism, though, is President Trump last night appointed Vice President Mike Pence to lead the task force against the coronavirus, in preparation for all of this. I actually thought it was a pretty good move because if anyone in the White House exudes calmness and confidence, it's Mike Pence. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, it's someone you would want in charge of something like this. But the media, nope, they're not happy about this. A lot of Democrats are using this as well to, even though this happens a lot. Vice presidents are often put in charge of stuff like this to get it going. But the media doesn't like it, including CNN reporter John Harwood, who said this after the press conference.
You also have the president appointing Mike Pence, saying he's really good on health. We all remember that as governor of Indiana, he struggled to cope with a public health crisis on HIV by delaying needle exchanges. That had real consequences in terms of lives lost. So the administration has not gotten its act together. Alex Azar was struggling openly with Mike Pence at that news conference, saying, I'm still in charge of the task force. This afternoon, they're going to have a meeting of the task force at HHS on Azar's turf. How is Mike Pence going to handle that? That's another test for the administration.
They just can't help but look for something. So the needle exchange thing, that's what they're blasting him on. What's that all about? Well, there was a certain area in Indiana when Mike Pence was governor there that had an outbreak of HIV. It was basically an outbreak among people who were addicted to heroin and drugs, and it was being spread through needles. So, of course, the left and a lot of people had a great idea. Why don't we just give them clean needles? They'll exchange their used ones, and we'll give them clean ones. And obviously, Mike Pence said, I'm not sure that's the greatest idea because we're still going to be encouraging them. Basically, you have a government basically encouraging them to continue on doing their heroin. And, they have clean needles, but they're still going to do it. And that means it still could be spread even more and more. I think there's a healthy skepticism to that plan.
And there still could be heroin ODs.
Yeah, so they won't die of HIV, but they'll die of a heroin overdose because they have clean needles now. But there might even more and more people starting to do more and more heroin because it's basically encouraged by the government at this point. I think if this is the best the Democrats and the left and the media have against Mike Pence, I don't think they have much of a leg to stand on. Now, they're criticizing him because he was asked about this when he was governor, and Mike Pence says, I'm going to go home and pray about it. You're going to pray? You can't pray. We need action. We don't like your prayers. Now, the other thing that they have a problem with Mike Pence is he defunded a lot of Planned Parenthood in the state.
Aha.
And so Planned Parenthood is where they did HIV testing, you know.
Aha.
So how he's anti-health because he defunded Planned Parenthood. No, I think Planned Parenthood is anti-health because they kill babies in the womb. They commit murder. And people say, well, that's not everything Planned Parenthood does. That's only a minority of what Planned Parenthood does. They still kill thousands of babies every year, and they get a lot of their funding from the killing of babies. So spare me the whole Mike Pence doesn't care about health when he wants to defund Planned Parenthood and maybe doesn't want to encourage people to continue doing heroin. I mean, I just think there was a reasonable reason why Mike Pence was pretty skeptical of needle exchanges. Now, you have some criticism. Apparently, he declared a state of emergency a little bit late in that state over this outbreak and stuff like that. Okay, that's a legitimate concern, but some of this other stuff, I'm just like, okay, come on, people. I'm not sure I buy it. We have to get into I wanted to point out one more thing here. Trump has not always been the best at this kind of stuff either. This is why I say both sides use this stuff for politics all the time. Trump, a few years ago, when Obama was in office, blasted Obama over Ebola. Here's that.
We have a tremendous problem in New York because President Obama would not stop the flights. So now we've got Ebola. He should be ashamed.
And as we know, Ebola really didn't really turn into much of nothing at the time. We didn't have a huge Ebola epidemic in the United States. I just point that out because I hate this. I hate the politics back and forth over stuff like this. It's like kids just yelling when I just want to say, okay, stop. Let's solve the problem. This isn't solving the problem.
My dad can beat your dad.
This is Beyond Reason Radio. I'm your host, Michael Yaffee. We'll be right back.
If you heart Beyond Reason Radio, listen to the Beyond Reason Radio podcast on iHeartRadio. Just download the iHeartRadio app and search Beyond Reason Radio. This is Orlando's Smart Talk Radio. Beyond Reason Radio continues now.
Castro, he wasn't all bad. He had a literacy program. I think teaching people to read is good. Okay, thanks, Bernie Sanders. And you know who else did a pretty good job at teaching people to read? The United States of America. I just wanted to point that out. He just loves to, he can't help but throw in some praise for these communist countries. And then when you talk about America, it's the opposite. You know, it's the opposite. Oh, yeah, America's good in some ways, but they're bad in all these ways. And when he talks about a communist country, he says, oh, they're bad in some ways, but they're good in these ways. It's like the opposite. It's very interesting. Welcome back to Beyond Reason Radio. The reason why I bring that up is because Bernie Sanders was a part of the Democrat debate in South Carolina a couple nights ago. Tuesday night. It was right after I did my last show. If you missed that show, by the way, you definitely want to catch it on the podcast, on your iHeartRadio app, or anywhere podcasts are available. But I wanted to, I could go over and say who won the debate, here's Biden, here's Klobuchar, here's Warren. Let's analyze every single one of their performances and blah, blah, blah. I feel like everybody's already done that. You can get that anywhere. I wanted to focus on things that really got my attention and things that were really important. And once again, it's really Bernie Sanders because he's the front runner and he's still the front runner. Even though it looks like Biden might actually win South Carolina. The latest polls have Biden up, and he got that endorsement by Claiborne, who's very prominent in South Carolina. But there were some things Bernie said that I still feel like deserve the scrutiny, really. And that's what I wanted to focus on, especially Sanders once again defending Castro, at least partly. Here he was during that debate.
I have opposed authoritarianism all over the world, and I was really amazed at what Mayor Bloomberg just said a moment ago. He said that the Chinese government is responsive to the Politburo. But who the hell is the Politburo responsive to? Who elects the Politburo? You got a real dictatorship there? Of course you have a dictatorship in Cuba. What I said is what Barack Obama said in terms of Cuba, that Cuba made progress on education. Yes, I think... Really? Really?
Yes, because there's no comparing those two
What Barack Obama said is they made great progress on education and health care. That was Barack Obama.
I talked to Barack Obama.
Excuse me. Occasionally, it might be good idea to be honest about American foreign policy. And that includes the fact that America has overthrown governments all over the world, in Chile, in Guatemala, in Iran. And when dictatorships, whether it is the Chinese or the Cubans, do something good, you acknowledge that. But you don't have trade love letters with
President
them.
Biden.
Why do you think, and here's what I was really thinking about this, why is Bernie Sanders so insistent on this point and other points when it comes to what these socialist dictators have done? Because he wants to defend the socialism itself. That's why he's doing that. See, someone like me and most people don't just criticize the fact that Cuba was a dictatorship. They criticize the fact that it was a communist, socialist economy as well, because socialism doesn't work even if it's not a dictatorship. So what Bernie Sanders is desperately trying to do is point out things that he believes were good in Cuba to defend socialism. That is what he's doing. He's trying to separate the authoritarianism and socialism. But as I told you in the last show, socialism is by its very nature authoritarian. Just because we vote in the leaders who implement socialist policies doesn't mean those socialist policies aren't authoritarian. They have to be, because socialism has to be pushed and forced by the government at the top. So when you vote in a leader who pushes that policy, it still takes away individual rights. That's why we have a constitution, not only so we have representatives of, by, and for the people. That was only part of it. The other part of the Constitution was individual rights and free markets, because freedom is not just being able to vote representatives. Freedom is also being able to make individual choices in the market, in your lives. Bernie is trying to sell you the point that all you need freedom is to be able to vote your representatives, and all the other socialism stuff, that you can have that and have freedom. You can't separate the two, but he's desperate to try to do that. That's why he's so insistent on this point, and it's extremely dangerous. By the way, when you're talking about literacy in Cuba, as I've mentioned before, they had like 80 to 90% literacy already before Castro. Not only that, but most of the world had increases in literacy at the same time. So to act like it was because of Cuba's literacy program that all of a sudden you have massive literacy in Cuba, that's just not true. They could have had just as much massive literacy progress in Cuba without Castro. So it's a lie and it's fixed. Now, one person who actually criticized Sanders over this was Van Jones, the communist himself, on CNN, saying Bernie messed up here.
I was disappointed with Bernie's answer on the socialism question. He had to know that was coming. There's no reason to do a big retrospective nostalgia scream fest about authoritarian regimes from the 70s. There was an opportunity for Bernie to clarify to the American people that when he says democratic socialism, that's the point. It's not that stuff from Cuba. It's not that stuff from the Soviet Union. It's the stuff that you see in Northern Europe that's working well for normal people, and they vote all the time. He failed to do that. It's unbelievable that he failed to do it. It's what a big chunk of our party needs to hear from him, and he did not do it tonight.
So there you go. It's very interesting. He's also trying to do what Bernie Sanders did, basically, and trying to separate the two. That socialism is okay as long as people elect the socialist. But no, it doesn't make it okay. It's still bad and still authoritarian by nature. Now, Mayor Pete Buttigieg actually had a pretty decent debate. He's good at his debates, although, I mean, he's just a white Obama. He's just a white Obama. He's basically trying to be like Obama. But he was at least willing to challenge Bernie because he realizes Bernie Sanders is the front runner here. And here's a part where he really goes after Bernie Sanders.
And I am not looking forward to a scenario where it comes down to Donald Trump with his nostalgia for the social order of the 1950s and Bernie Sanders with the nostalgia for the revolutionary politics of the 1960s. This is not about what coups were happening in the 1970s or 80s. This is about the future. This is about 2020. We are not going to survive or succeed, and we're certainly not going to win by reliving the Cold War. And we're not going to win these critical House and Senate races if people in those races have to explain why the nominee of the Democratic Party is telling people to look at the bright side of the Castro regime. We've got to be a lot smarter about this and look to the future. Sanders.
I mean, he's at least at the end there, he's exactly right. Bernie Sanders is a big problem for them when it comes to down ballot races. But also, when you're talking about, let's look at the bright side of Cuba and Fidel Castro. No, I don't know if that's going to help you win elections, especially here in Florida. Now, if you want a cut that is so instructive of how this whole debate went, and it really was a mess. I've never seen a mess of a debate. And it was so distracting, honestly, because they just kept talking over each other constantly. And the moderators were blamed for a lot of this. And maybe they deserve part of the blame because they kept, trying so hard to stick to the clock instead of kind of flowing with it. But one thing you brought up, Tom Benz, I thought was very interesting was, why didn't they cut off the other mics? Like when it was one person, maybe that's really difficult to do, but that would have been a way to solve the problem, is to have only one mic on at a time. But they kept interrupting each other. It was like a kindergarten class, and the moderators were trying to be like school teachers. Be quiet or you'll get detention. But it's just
class. Oh, class.
And what I don't understand is, why do the other candidates think that's good? Well, it doesn't. Warren did it a lot. She was interrupting people.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't make me feel better for Warren. It didn't help her appeal to me. So I was like, why do they think this is a good thing? It just makes it seem like you're desperate.
The word I keep thinking about is civility. There was none of it.
Yeah, exactly. But this cut here is very instructive of that point. And also something else another point I want to make, but here it is.
Do we think health care for all, Pete, is some kind of radical communist idea? Do we think raising the minimum wage to a living wage? Do we think building the millions of units of affordable housing that we need? Do we think raising taxes on billionaires is a radical idea?
Let's talk about what's radical about that plan.
Reform is a radical idea.
The things you just named.
Do we think immigration reform? The truth is, Pete, that the American people support my agenda. That is why I am beating Trump in virtually every poll that has done, and why I will defeat him.
We got to open this up. Universal health care first.
Senator Klobuchar.
Right,
Donald Trump's Bernie.
Gee, wait.
What's funny is Pete Buttigieg once again was right, challenging Bernie Sanders on what he said. Do you think it's radical? And he was going to point out, yeah, I'm pretty radical when you actually look at the numbers and look at the details. If you're playing, yeah, it's very radical. And I noticed what Bernie Sanders did during the debate. What he kept doing, every time he was challenged, he would basically just say the same thing but louder. So, like, he didn't say anything new that he hasn't said before. He just got louder about it and more upset about it, and still wouldn't actually give you details of the plan, just tell you why America is so terrible and why we need socialism and why he's not radical, because America is terrible. This isn't a radical plan. We need these radical plans basically because America's awful. I mean, that's basically what he was getting at there. You want to hear a radical plan, though? Listen to this plan by Bernie Sanders. Here it is.
We have a criminal justice system today that is not only broken, it is racist, got more people in jail than any other country on earth, including China. And one of the reasons for that is a horrific war on drugs. So I do believe that on day one, we will change the Federal Controlled Substance Act, which, if you can believe it, now equates heroin with marijuana. That's insane. We're going to take marijuana out of that and effectively legalize marijuana in every state in the country. What we are also going to do is move to expunge the records of those people who are arrested for possession of marijuana. And I'll tell you what else we're going to do. We're going to provide help to the African American, Latino, Native American community to start businesses to sell legal marijuana rather than let a few corporations control the legalized marijuana market.
Your plan is to have young African Americans sell weed?
Well, that's what they're doing now.
Oh, jeez. This obsession with that drug.
And I'm sure
I hate it.
They would pay their business taxes, I'm sure.
No, I don't know. I mean, his whole point is that if you legitimize it, then they wouldn't have to sell it on the street. There would be legitimate business owners, whatever. But just the obsession with that drug and that it's going to solve the nation's problems is so dumb. But another thing he said that really bothers me is he talked about China in that cut. Oh, they have more prisoners here than China. I love how we try to make comparisons of our justice system to Chinese justice system when we just had massive protests in Hong Kong because they didn't want to be part of China's justice system. They literally had massive protests in Hong Kong where people were waving American flags because they understood that if you want to be like a justice system, you would much rather be like the justice system in the United States than the one in China, where a lot of people aren't in jail because they're just killed and executed.
And, of course, right. And he didn't mention all the people who have been rounded up and put in concentration camps.
Exactly. The Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs or whatever it is, rounded up by, I think, the thousands, if not the millions, and put into concentration camps. It's so absurd when socialists like Bernie Sanders trying to make China look good and make us look bad. Our justice system, it sucks. It's basically worse than China. This is Beyond Reason Radio. I'm your host, Michael Yaffee. We'll be right back.
Download the iHeart Radio app and catch the Beyond Reason Radio podcast. The conscience in your ear telling you the difference between right and wrong. Yaffee is back on the air.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Beyond Reason Radio. We have been on since 7 p.m. right here on News Radio WFLA Orlando. But if you missed any of the show, make sure to catch the podcast that anywhere podcasts are available. We've been talking about the Democrat debate. We are going to get into something that made Yaffee Laffee in just a moment, but I thought I would play a voice of reason of the day because we've been talking about the Beyond Reason proposals by Bernie Sanders. He said he basically admits that it would cost $60 trillion for most of his proposals over 10 years. But if that's not enough for you, Mark Thiessen, who works for the American Enterprise Institute, he's on Fox News a lot. He was on Fox News earlier this week, and he basically pointed out that's actually a lowball estimate. It's going to cost a lot more than $60 trillion. Here's what he said.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Pete Buttigieg made the mistake of trying to speak over Comrade Sanders when he was commanding the audience. So I mean that was his first mistake. But look, I mean I think the Democratic candidate. I think Pete Buttigieg said he has $50 trillion in spending plans. Mm-hmm. That's actually about wrong by about half. Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute calculated the cost of Sanders' spending plans. It's $97.5 trillion. Let me say that again. That's not a typo. $97.5 trillion. To put that in perspective, the total household wealth of every single American in 2018 was $98 trillion. That's the value of all the homes and cars, college funds, pension plans, retirement funds that we have. All our assets is $98 trillion. He wants to spend $97.5. If Bernie Sanders is elected, 70% of GDP will be spent by government at all levels, and half of all Americans will be working for the government. That is just the idea that that we would nominate someone with those kinds of plans and that person has a realistic chance of becoming president of the United States is terrifying.
Yeah, it is terrifying. That's it, $97 trillion. But I always tell people When it comes to Sanders, he doesn't care about the cost. Why doesn't he care about the cost? Because this isn't about just implementing another big program by government in our society. This is about radical transformation of how our economy works, how our society works, how our government works. So to him, all that stuff's going to be worked out later. It's going to be restructured completely through our new economy, our new socialist economy. He said there 70% of our economy would be full of government workers or whatever that is. I mean, that's crazy. It's absurd. It's complete transformation. That's why Bernie doesn't care about the cost, because it's not about, how are we going to pay for this? It's about, we're going to totally transform our society. So why don't we end the show right now with something that made Yaffee Laffee. So you'll like this one.
All right.
I got this from the New York Times.
Funny paper.
New study here. Millennial men embrace gender equality. So men in my generation, we're more likely to embrace gender equality, right?
I hear a but coming up.
But not vacuuming.
And you know who wrote this article, don't you?
Who?
A female.
Yeah, you're right. Claire Kane Miller did write it. Says young people today have become much more open-minded about gender roles. It shows up in their attitudes about pronouns, politics, and sports. But in one area, change has been minimal. They are holding on to traditional views about who does what at home. A new survey by Gallup found that among opposite-sex couples, those 18 to 34, basically millennials and the oldest members of Generation Z, were no more likely than older couples to divide household chores equitably. And a sociology study published last month found that when high school seniors were asked about their ideal family arrangement, almost a quarter said it was for the man to work full-time and the woman to tend to children, a larger share than desired any other arrangement.
Sounds like we're back in the 50s.
What's amazing is I'm sure women and men said that.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why it tends to be divided up that way is because women tend to care more about that stuff.
Men are lazy.
Well, they just don't. Yeah, it's not even that they're lazy. They're lazy about certain things.
Right. At home, yeah.
At home, they just don't. They're not. Their mind doesn't work that way. There are things that I'm learning now. I mean, my fiance doesn't even live with me, but just spending more time with her, there's just certain things that she does for my place that I wouldn't have really even thought of because they just think differently.
Like what I tell my wife often. I said I'd do it. You don't have to remind me every 6 months to do it.
Yeah, but nice. But I mean, it's kind of like, one of the first things she did for me was she bought these new dish towels or something. Like it's something like I was using like paper towels or something. And no, you have to have dish towels. And I had to like dial soap or Dawn soap in the bathroom one time because I ran out of the other stuff. No, that's for dishes. You need hand soap. It's just, little stuff like that.
Sure.
That they just care about more. But yeah, apparently men are pigs and still don't want to vacuum, even in our millennial generation. Appreciate you listening to the show. Make sure if you missed any of the show, you can catch the podcast anywhere that podcasts are available, especially in your iHeart Radio app. And the last podcast was interesting too. I talked a lot about Bernie Sanders there. So if you didn't listen to that one, listen to that one, listen to this one, listen to me as much as you can, subscribe to it, share it with your friends, like the Beyond Reason Radio Facebook page. Okay, that's enough self-promotion for me. Appreciate you listening to the show. I'll be back next time.